See so many people gather here this morning in this rescheduled Loudoun Community Breakfast event. I'm Pastor Steve Dawson, and I feel so privileged to be able to introduce John and Victoria Mizerak, the first couple to share together at a breakfast event. Usually it's a guy or a lady individually, but this is the first time that Paul has asked a couple to share, and he couldn't have chosen a better couple. I met John almost 20 years ago. He owned a printing company in Loudoun County, and he asked me to serve as his company chaplain. And so for many years, I walked alongside John, his wife Molly, and a number of employee team members. John spoke at this breakfast about 9 years ago. He shared at that event how his life was shattered with the sudden closing of his business and Molly's passing shortly thereafter. He was really struggling, as you might expect from both of those events. But then God restored his life in large part by bringing new love into John's life. John and Victoria met at a mutual friends Bible study, and they became fast friends and were married about 1 year later. Even though they came together from very different backgrounds and places, their story is one of transformation, where the Lord has transformed them individually and as a couple into the couple that they are today. So would you join me? Warm welcome to John and Victoria Mizerak.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everybody. A lot of you here have heard my story 9 years ago, but some of you haven't. So I'm going to give you a quick recap, even though Steve kind of already did. I had a fairy tale life. I was able to marry my college sweetheart and had this vision and dream to really live out the American dream. I was able to start my own company at 25. At the same time, had my first son, who's here today, and just had an amazing time building a business, building a family and a marriage. Have 3 kids, and it was amazing. Life was good. And in between 2006 and 2010, my life came crumbling down. I first was in the printing business, which, as you all know, the whole industry changed at that time because of the internet. And instead of sticking to my business of printing, I decided to become a commercial real estate mogul like Jan Zacharias. And instead, I ended up on the wrong end of that in 2008 and pretty much lost everything by 2010. I was millions of dollars in net worth in the early 2000s to about $500,000 in debt by the time 2010 came. Lost everything, lost my house. As you can imagine, as a man, that was about the most crippling thing that anyone can go through. And I thought it was that. I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. And sadly, it got worse. And in the next year, my first wife, Molly, contracted brain cancer and died in just 3 months. So in a matter of 18 months, I pretty much lost everything. Thank God my kids were older, well established, and on their own, because at that point I was absolutely a mess and I was worthless to them for sure. And then I had this epiphany to kind of press into what Molly had really had a passion for. Ministry that Steve mentioned, Catholics for Christ, that Joe Curto runs. Molly was raised Catholic, even though I wasn't. I was kind of interested in what she was so interested in, so I went ahead and just made myself go. I was pretty much a mess every time I went, but I really liked Joe, and I really came to really respect him even more as he taught me through that summer that she died. And one night I was there with my hat down in tears, and I got a tap on the shoulder and I turned around, and there was this redhead standing behind me. And I'm going to let her share her end of the story because that's where Victoria came into my life.
All right, so my story is one of restoration, and I just pray it encourages you all. John and I definitely came from two different backgrounds. I mean, he did have the ideal life and marriage and everything, and it's something I always wanted. And it was elusive to me. So anyway, there's a promise in the Bible where God says, I will restore the years the locusts have eaten. I will, definitely, I will restore the years the locusts have eaten. And I just want to emphasize that because that's exactly what the Lord did for me. So anyway, I was raised in a very strict Catholic home. And my father was a World War II bomber pilot in the South Pacific, and then a fighter pilot in Europe. And he was a Silver Star awarded hero. And so when he said jump, you jumped. And if you didn't, usually there was some pain involved. So my mother, on the other hand, she was born in Australia, and my father met her while he was in the South Pacific. And they had this incredible love story, so much so that my mother ended up traveling in a ship during World War II on a injured soldier ship, MTS ship, I think it's called. Anyway, across the South Pacific in World War II to get to the United States to marry my father, who had then been called to the other theater in Europe. Anyway, it was this tremendous love story, one I grew up with, and one I always thought that I was going to have. So my father, he believed that children were supposed to be seen and not heard. My mother, on the other hand, she loved children, she adored them, but she always made sure she had time for her golf game. She was an amazing athlete, and also for the officers club because she loved to dress in her gowns and wear her white elbow-length gloves and do that whole thing. She had me when she was 40. I had 4 older brothers. The oldest one next to me was 5 years older, and then the oldest one was 15 years older. And I think they were not very happy that they had a little sister because that just completely messed up the basketball game that they wanted. Anyway, as most youngest of the family, all I wanted to do was to be accepted by my brothers and to fit in. And I slowly learned that the only way that that was possibly going to happen is if I didn't rock the boat and I just submitted and did what they wanted me to do. So between both my father, who was very strict and very, obedience is what you do, and also my brothers, who I just wanted to like, I learned obedience and submission very well. And on top of that, while I was growing up, I suffered a sexual violation. And without realizing it, as I grew up, I equated sex as love. So with all these experiences, the need for acceptance, submission, sex equals love, it was not a good setup for my love story. And by the age of 17, I was hanging around definitely the wrong crowd. I was drinking heavily and doing all different types of drugs. And I was rebelling against everything, my parents, teachers, the police, every authority in my life. And the next thing I knew, I was pregnant. And for 6 weeks, I was a mother, and then I had an abortion. And that abortion led to a terrible infection. And it landed me in the hospital for a week or so on an IV antibiotics, and the doctor told my mother and I, because my father didn't know anything about this, because of course in a strict Catholic home that wasn't happening. So, but the doctor told my mother and I that I would never have children. And at 17, it didn't really mean much to me. I didn't really think it through. But you'd think that that would have sobered me up, but instead I just went off the deep end. So I went from an AB student, and finally after my junior year to a D student, and then finally after my junior year I dropped out and got my GED. So while most girls my age were going to dances and proms and graduation ceremonies and planning for college. I was driving an auto parts truck part-time and getting wasted with my friends the rest of the time. So shortly after a while, a couple of months or so, my mother finally intervened. And she thought that it would be this great idea for me to go to modeling school. And I just hated the idea. I'd much rather be partying with my friends, but she would drive me every week to Tyson's Corner to this modeling school. And I just hated it anyway. But while attending modeling school, I ran into this scout agent from John Casablanca's Elite Models. And they asked if I wanted to come to New York and work with them. Every girl's dream, right? I mean, my mother was thrilled. I was terrified. I didn't want anything to do with it. Anyway, so for a model to make it in New York, they need a portfolio with tear sheets, which are sheets torn from a magazine. And all the fashion magazines are really in Europe. There's only like 5 or 7 here in the States. So every girl, when they start modeling, they go to Europe to get a strong portfolio together so that they can come back to New York and then try and make it. For as the song goes, I don't think I turned my phone off either. Anyway, I just remembered that. Anyway, as the song
probably
goes,
Gary Williams.
That's right. As the song goes, right? If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. So that's where every model wants to get to. Before I knew it, at the age of 19 now, I was on a jumbo jet heading for Paris, France. And the agent that was supposed to pick me up at the airport didn't show. So thank God there was another agent there from a different agency, and he recognized this, newbie model, and he took me to the modeling apartment where I was supposed to be. I later found out that the agent that was supposed to pick me up was hungover and sleeping. So this was my welcome to Paris. So life in Paris was definitely a jet set lifestyle. The first night I was there, I met a man who owned his own nightclub called the Privé, which meant private. So it was a private club with all the stars and the actors and the athletes and the Grand Prix drivers and things like that. So from the first night I was there for a year, I was there every single night, except one. I was sick. And one night I even went straight from the club to work. That didn't go very well. But anyway, I did pretty well in Paris, and I got a really strong book. And after 1 year of that lifestyle, I was an emotional wreck. And I just knew I needed to go home and get grounded again with my family. And anyway, I was just about to do a huge 3-day Valentino campaign. And it would have skyrocketed my career, and I didn't care. I just knew I needed to go home. So my agents were furious, but I jumped on a plane and came home. So I just want to make it clear that, again, even though modeling was an exciting time of travel and the finest things of life, it was not my heart. My heart, again, was always to be home. My heart was to be married. My heart was to have children one day and live happily ever after. I wanted, my parents' love story. But the attention and the acceptance I got from being a model, even from my brothers, that was addictive. So when New York called a month later, I went on up there to live and to work in New York City. So it was frightening at first, it's a huge city, but once I got there, I got in my groove. But I must say that groove also consisted of me getting on a plane every weekend. People's Express flew for $19 at that time, dating myself. And so anyway, so I would come home every weekend just to be with my family. And one of those weekends, hi. Oh my goodness. So anyway, one of those weekends.
When do I get
Yes, I know. Hold on. Anyway, you can see the difference between the three. Anyway, so one of those weekends, I hooked up with a guy I knew from high school. And he ended up being my boyfriend for the next 7 years. And that really helped me have the stability and security I so desperately needed at that time with this this modeling career. And I thought maybe he is my love story. Well, I commuted back and forth from Virginia to New York over the years, and I slowly shifted out of modeling and I went into more commercials. The modeling business was very pretentious and the people were very pretentious, and commercials, just everybody was cool, it was easy, and I had a very easy time getting commercials. In modeling at the time, redheads were either Brides Magazine or they were Cosmopolitan. And it wasn't until Princess Fergie with her red hair came on the scene that redheads became a little bit more commercialized, where they would sell advertisement products, things like that. So anyway, commercials were a lot easier. I had at one point 3 national network let's start this again. At one point I had 10 national network commercials running at the same time for 3 years consecutively. So the money was just crazy money. It was awesome, but it was crazy. But it allowed me to work 3 months, travel 3 months, work 3 months, travel 3 months. So it was a really great time that way. And even though my career was successful, my personal life, again, was not. So when my boyfriend and I broke up, I began a yearly carousel of boyfriends looking for my love story. So around age 32, I moved in with a man, a New York City man, and lived with him a total of 7 years. And a few years before he and I broke up, my world collapsed. My father, who I adored, you never know when the emotions are gonna come, right? Anyway, my father, who I adored, had a stroke. So I made one of my last commercials and I moved home. I had bought a house near my parents, so I just moved in there. And I gave my boyfriend, my New York boyfriend at the time, an ultimatum. I said, marry me or else. And so he said, okay. And he really didn't want, it was definitely the twisting of the arm. So anyway, he moved to Virginia and we got married. It was just in the basement of my parents' house. It was just my family. It was very low key, very kind of hush hush. Anyway, I knew the next morning I had made this terrible mistake. And in January 2000, we were together for another year, and in January 2000, my father passed away. My husband and I broke up, and he went back to New York. I was beyond devastated. I had all these men in my life. My father was always this one person, and now it seemed like all the men were gone in my life. My parents were always my one constant, you know, with all the ups and downs of my career and of my relationships and everything. They were just always that one place I could go to for safety and stability. Anyway, so now my father's gone. I had a meltdown and an emotional breakdown in my house that I owned. And so shortly after, I moved in with my mom, who also was broken since my dad had passed. And so here we were, 2 really, you know, broken women in a home. I'm there in her basement at 40 years old. I had no husband, no children, no love story, no career, no Virginia friends. I had no hope for a future. I mean, I was shattered. I was in bed, I wasn't eating, the whole depressed scene, it was really bad. The one question that kept coming to my mind is will I ever see my dad again? Is my dad in heaven? And then I thought, God, do I even believe in heaven? Do I even believe in God? I mean, I was raised Catholic. I was taught God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, heaven, hell. But did I really believe it? So I made a choice. Yes, I'm going to believe it. God is real. Heaven is real. And my Father, who believed that Jesus died for his sins, is there. He's in heaven and he's with Jesus. So I wasn't really expecting anything to change, but this is where my life began to change dramatically. I had met a girl through the last man I had dated, Rita Clark, who couldn't be here today. And one day she called me and she asked, Oh, did I even talk about that? I didn't. I missed all that. So before, hold on, this is important because before I went to all this stuff I just said, I had tried one more time to go with another man to fill the hole in my heart, and it failed miserably. So that's where I met Rika. Okay. So anyway, so Rika's asking me to church now because she knew how shattered I was. And I was like, dang. All I can say is that pain and devastation will certainly motivate a person to do anything. So I went. So one thing led to another, and the next thing I knew, I was in a Bible study class with like housewives and church ladies. I mean, it's just not a place I ever thought, I'd be, right? So anyway, I mean, it was a little embarrassing, but it's embarrassing now, but that was how I felt, really. I was just kind of out of, anyway. After attending for a few weeks, I was asked if I wanted to give my heart to Jesus, to surrender my life to him and make him Lord over my life and follow his teachings. This was a huge decision for many reasons. A few times while I lived in New York, a model would come and ask me this question, and I would think to myself, stop doing things my way? Submit to Jesus, a man? Yeah, that didn't go too well for me in the past. And typically when I was told I couldn't do something, I wanted to do it all the more. And plus, to be honest, I was a single woman, right? So I didn't really want to give up my life. But as I contemplated how terrible things were going with me leading my own life, I realized I really didn't have a choice. I was in such desperate emotional pain, right, Ariel? You remember? Anyway, so I did it. I asked Jesus into my life. I just didn't think anything was going to happen. I had no idea, but all I can tell you is it was mind-blowing, amazing what started to happen. Besides my prayers being answered before I could even pray them, God would just answer, and reveal that he was real. The Bible says that when we ask Jesus into our hearts, the Holy Spirit comes in and guarantees us of heaven. And it says that we will know that we're a child of God, and his spirit will bear witness to our spirit. So basically there's a supernatural transaction that happens, that you can't tell anybody about. It just happens when you ask Jesus into your heart. So I was just like completely sold. I knew that God was real. I knew that I'd follow him anywhere. I knew that I could trust him. I knew I could submit to him. So anyway, one of the biggest things, I just wanted to share a couple of things. He's coming right up. I think it's even on this page. So this guy here. Okay. So one of the biggest things that happened to me is, so I'm newly in my mom's basement and I'm beginning to read the Bible. And I went, it was like 10:30 because that's when Tony Evans started, and I just got turned on to Tony Evans. So I got up and I went over to the table to turn on the radio, and all of a sudden, those of you who know the story of Saul becoming Paul, and he had this veil removed from his eyes, well, that's an experience I had. I had like this, it was like this sheer veil, I don't know how else to describe it, and it just went like this. And I could almost hear the tinkling on the table below me. And it was like all of a sudden this computer chip was inserted into my brain, and I knew exactly more what Tony Evans was saying. And when I went back to the Bible, I understood even more of what the Bible was saying. It was like I was living in black and white, and all of a sudden now I was living in color. It was crazy. So those kinds of things were happening all the time. I remember I was driving in Fairfax down Pickett Road, and this was early on still. I was just saved. And I was like, where am I going to live? I'm here in Fairfax. Where am I going to live? I'm going to go to Portofino. I should live in Portofino. No, I should live in Malibu. Yeah, that's right. What should I do? Why am I here? It was just one of those. And finally, it was as if it was just pulled out from my head. It was gone. And in place was this peace and this complete knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, taking care of my mom, and I never questioned it again. Those voices just completely disappeared from me. The same thing happened with cussing. I used to cuss like a sailor, and one day God just like, zoop, and it was gone. And it was crazy because I had tried to stop before, and I just never did. And then he just took it and gone. So it was crazy. The last story about what God did is that this was a little later on in my Bible study and all. I got a great group of housewives, and and they all were praying for my brother who had suffered for like 20 years of an autoimmune disease, and God made him well. I mean, it was awesome. So it was blowing my mind. Anyway, so I'm in my mother's basement. I just wanted to say that I spent 10 years. I'm 40, 10 years in my mother's basement.
Wait a minute. You said you were only 35.
Shut up. You be quiet over there. This is my turn. Oh my goodness. Okay, so where am I? He's
40
coming
years.
up. Yeah. I spent 40 years. Oh, he wasn't on this page. I am wrong. Okay. And so, in hindsight, the 40 years, the first year I felt like God was healing me and cleansing me of all the yuck of trying to find love in all the wrong places. I felt like he was cleansing me the first 2 years, really. And then the last 8 years, I felt like God was teaching me what real love looked like, because I really didn't know at all. As I learned about God's love for me and how he loved me no matter what, and that he laid down his life for me, he was asking me to love my mother in the same way. If my mother had been how she used to be, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But with my father's passing, she suffered with severe anxiety and fear, and the pills she took to alleviate those feelings created memory loss and then slowly dementia. It was heartbreaking, to say the least, but also extremely challenging. It was challenging because I had always lived my life for myself. When I wanted to do something, I did it. And when I didn't want to do it, I didn't do it. If it felt good, I did it. If it didn't feel good, I didn't do it. It was very simple. But to lay down my life and care for my mother, this was very new territory for me. The last 2 years of my mother's, in my mother's basement, it was pretty amazing. The transforming power of Jesus was amazing, because I really didn't care if I was married or not anymore, or if I had children or not anymore. God had brought along a great Bible church, a great group of people, some wonderful prayer warriors, Ariel sitting right there, that took me through this time. Thank you. Anyway, I'm such an ugly crier. I hate doing this in public. Okay. So anyway, I was so in love with Jesus. And God would have it, and as God would have it, it was at that time, and I didn't need anything else, that he would lead me to a Bible study class in a Catholic church in a little town an hour away in Purcellville, Virginia. Get it? That's
where I come in.
Anyway, a friend of mine had invited me and told me that to this Bible study, and told me that there was this man in the class who 1 month earlier had lost his wife. I was like, oh God, please don't let me have to talk to this man. What do you say to somebody like that, right? And when I walked in class, I knew exactly who this man was. He had his baseball cap pulled way down over his face, so you couldn't see the tears in his eyes, but you saw him anyway. And John was telling people how the next day he was going to go to Zambia and build an orphan home in memory of his wife, Molly. So back to the house that I had the emotional breakdown in, I sold that years later, back then. I had sold that house, and I had tithed my money, all but $3,000. And God had told me at that time that he wanted me to give some of the money to, hey, where are you going? Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Anyway, got it. A little bit too laid back, Victoria. Okay? So God had told me to tithe that money, the last $3,000, to give it to an orphanage. And I didn't know of an orphanage at that time. And I didn't have time to look into an orphanage, but it was just back here. I knew that God had told me that. So anyway, in this Bible study class, there's time where you're quiet with the Lord. And so during the quiet time, I'm sitting there with the Lord, and all of a sudden I feel God tap me on my shoulder. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, what about that money for the orphanage? I'm like, oh, right. So I take out my checkbook and I write a check for $1,000. And John was sitting in front of me, tapped him on the shoulder. And he's like, and I hand him this check. And he just said, he's like completely bothered by the interruption because, of course, he's in his pain, right? And I'm like, oh God, that's so much fun. And, what else are we going to do, God? Anyway, so I'm back in my quiet time and I feel tapping on my heart again. I'm like, yeah. He's like, what about the rest of it? I'm like, right. Like, that makes sense. So I tap John back on the shoulder, and he's like, what? I was like, can I have that check back? He's like, oh. It's better. So I take it, and I tear it up, and I write $3,000, and I tap him back on the shoulder again, and he's just like, crazy lady, what in the world? And he takes it and shoves it in. Now, he'll say that I bought his love for $3,000 that day, and that I wrote my number on that check, but I did not do any of those things. So anyway, 1 year later, to the day we met in Bible study, he got down on his knee at a Catholic church in Percival and proposed to me. And not only that, but he had arranged a huge surprise engagement party. And so we went to our friend's house to tell them we were engaged, but he had already planned. And out on the porch were my friends, was my mother, my cousins, his siblings, his mother. It was love story. I got my love story, right? So it was so awesome. My wedding day was everything I always wanted. It was a country wedding and a country church, and at 50 years old, I walked down an aisle unashamed in my white wedding dress. And even though I never had children, God blessed me and grafted me into a family with 3 grown children, Jamie and Chris, 1 year, and Sammy. And even the best part is now I have, 10 years later, 7 grandchildren. So I have so much fun with them. Anyway, so Paul has asked if we'd share very quickly, we're almost done, don't go anywhere, what has gone on since we've been married. So what God's been doing since we've been married. So John?
Well, I wanted to share a little bit more about the crazy thing that happened before we met. Was a lady that Molly had led to the Lord 4 weeks after she died, contacted me and said, I had a dream last night, and Molly and I were sitting in a chapel, and you were 2 rows ahead of us, and there was a lady sitting ahead of us in the first row, and Molly pointed to her and said, this is going to be John's next wife. And I thought, I'm like, what, you're an idiot? Like, why would anybody call me, 4 weeks after my wife died to tell me some crazy thing like that? Well, 6 weeks after Molly died, that's exactly what happened. Was we were in a chapel and she was sitting behind me, tapped me on the shoulder, and I completely forgot about it because I just got it out of my brain because I thought it was silly. And a year later, I told the story, and that lady contacted me and said, don't you remember my dream? That's exactly what happened. So I believe, as hard as my life was and the major loss Molly was in my life, that this is ordained and God's given me a second chance. Anybody who's lost a spouse or even divorce knows that there's a lot of regret that can be involved in that. I could have been a much better father, could have been a much better husband. And, the enemy has a way to take you and kick you when you're down. So I was feeling a lot of regret for what I could have done. And then Victoria came along, and I had an opportunity to be the man that I should have been with Molly, with her. And I see it as truly as a second chance blessing, and I believe God is a God of second chances. So don't despise the second chances, because again, life can get pretty rough for all of us, and we've all had trauma, and God's there for us, waiting for us to take the second chance with Him. So I can't say it's easy. I wouldn't recommend anybody get remarried at 50, because like you find your what we call a groove in marriage, but a lot of times it's a rut. But we're comfortable, and we kind of know what buttons not to push when you're married for 27 years, like I was. Even though my marriage was great, and but again, we were comfortable, and when we got married, nothing was comfortable. I say God has a sense of humor, because first of all, Molly was Catholic and Victoria's Catholic, so I've got that guilt on me. And Victoria, as much as I love her, is a polar opposite of me, and God had that plan from before I was born, because I needed that and she needed me, mainly so we can minister to other people, because now I have to submit to God, and as I try to learn and do the right thing for her at now 61, and we've been married 10 years now, believe it or not, and I have to be careful, because a lot of times I'll say, you know, my first wife, and then I have to get morbid and say, I mean my deceased wife, when I tell people stories like this, but I just believe that God has so blessed me by allowing me to go through what I went through so that we could land where we've landed, and that I could fulfill her love story.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a heart touching, right? Since John and I have been married, God has taught me a lot about being a wife and about godly submission. Whereas before I would have fought against that word with everything in my being. Now I know that it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced, is being a wife and being able to submit to a godly man. Also, God has used John in the most tenderest of ways to me. I had to learn to shed a lot of incorrect ideas about beauty and about being accepted. I still am, but I certainly have been on a process of it. After 30 years in a career where 90% is rejection, it takes its toll. I'm coming to understand, though, that acceptance is not something you achieve or something that you get from somebody because of how you look or what you do. It's something you live out of. God has accepted me. And as I learn to live more out of that place, I can grow into all that God created me to be. And that, I'm learning, is true beauty. In conclusion, God's word proves to be true. God grabbed hold of me and got me back on the track for my life, the life He wanted for me all along. It was and is so much better than anything that I ever had experienced before. All the riches and the coolest things and the coolest people could not compare with Him and what He has planned for all of us. If you're waiting for Him to restore something in your life, don't give up. And if you haven't experienced Him yet, I encourage you with all of my heart to ask Jesus to come into your heart. It is never, ever too late. He created each of us individually for something. And as my dear friend Rika Clark would always say, don't you want to know what it is? Thank you, guys.